Yep.
Are we good to
And
go?
you're live.
Very good. Thank you. Hey, we'll start the Housing Committee meeting of Akron City Council. We'd like to entertain a motion to accept the minutes of the last meeting.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
That's very good. The ayes have it. Thank you for that. We have, in essence, two items for discussion here today. The first item is under the new list of legislation. Actually, both of them are. It's an ordinance amending and or supplementing Title 15, Land Usage, Chapter 150, Environmental Health Housing Code to add sections 150.51, 150.52 to create legal defenses in an eviction matter for tenants who attempt to tender all past due rental payments to a landlord and capping the amount of reasonable late fees that landlord may impose on a tenant. So, oh yes, Mr. Hardy, I see. Will be presenting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, this piece and the one that we have following it are simple but yet meaningful protections for Akron's renters. This particular piece, Mr. Chairman, is referred to often as pay to stay legislation. What it does in effect is create an affirmative defense in our code for tenants who offer to pay all past due rent, including late fees, prior to the eviction judgment. So this is really for right before an eviction or after an eviction has been filed, but before judgment. It provides in our code for a pathway, another tool in the toolbox, if you will, for a tenant and our advocacy organizations who we have with us today too to help answer questions. It creates that affirmative defense and that ability to handle the issue before the eviction actually goes through. And so what has happened in other communities with pay to stay legislation once it's been enacted, oftentimes those that are able to pay and pay in full all the back due rent, the judge will dismiss the case, the eviction does not go through, and you're able to stay, hence the pay to stay. But this is something that currently doesn't exist in our code. We also, as you articulated, Mr. Chairman, are creating a cap on late fees, $25 to the greater of $25 or 5% of the monthly rent. This is again trying to get at exorbitant late fees that can rack up the past due amount very quickly and put a tenant in a position where beyond just the rent, it's very hard for them to get up to current once that eviction has either been threatened or filed. And so again, I think this piece of legislation and the following one really represent, in our opinion, the bare minimum that we should be doing to create a level playing field for our tenants. Right now, the system is essentially fixed on behalf of the landlord, which is why, in part, Akron is the eviction capital of Ohio and the 24th or 25th per capita worst eviction city in America. It's very simple to do, and there aren't very many protections at all for the renter or the tenant. And so this particular piece, Mr. Chairman, deals solely with that, creating that affirmative defense within our code and that cap on late fees. And I would invite, I don't know how you would like to do this, Mr. Chairman, if you want to read in the next one, and then we can go to others, but we do have representatives from Fair Housing here in Akron, and of course, Professor Brant Lee, who chairs our Akron Civil Rights Commission. And a lot of this work, these two pieces, came about through the work of the eviction task force that was going on even prior to COVID, and even the mayor's racial equity and social justice subcommittee looking at housing. And so these are, again, simple but meaningful steps in terms of trying to create a level playing field. So I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman, if you want to do questions on this, and we'll go from there.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hardy. Thank you. Yeah, I'll go ahead and read. I mean, the second piece, and we can talk about them, together, I guess. The second piece, and maybe James, if you'd like to give us like a couple sentences on kind of like what this next one is, the one in reference to the, looking at it right now, there's just really a couple of changes to it. The source of income, I guess, it's kind of one begets another in a way, kind of, but it's all thematically, I think, the same. So for the record, though, I will read in the third new piece of legislation for those of us keeping score. It's amending and or supplementing Title III, Chapter 38, Unlawful Discrimination, Section 38.01, definitions of the Code of Ordinances in the City of Akron to prohibit discrimination on the basis of lawful source of income. So James, will go ahead and give us a couple sentences about this, and then Professor Lee or a friend from the Fair Housing, if they'd like to go next, we'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, this companion piece, and you're right, these are really dual pieces, is also referred to as the source of income legislation. Akron would be joining 10 other municipalities. Cleveland is still pending, but there's a movement in Ohio and across the country, really, in response to the pandemic, to create specific source of income protections within our anti-discrimination code. Simply put, this piece of legislation will end discrimination based on how you pay your rent. So you can no longer, as a landlord, say, I'm not going to accept that form of payment. If it's a legal form of payment, you have to accept it. And so what this does is it really ends, whether that's a CARES Act grant that you get through 211 because you've gotten laid off because of the pandemic, whether it's I needed a loan from my mom and dad to get past a couple months, or yes, a housing voucher. You can no longer discriminate if you're a landlord in the city of Akron based on how your tenant pays, provided they pay the full amount. And so this is really important legislation, obviously, to provide true housing choice in our community, so that, you know, however you are piecing together your rent, if you're paying in full, the landlord cannot discriminate against you in that regard. And as we know, and really not just Akron, across the country and across Ohio, this has not been the case. You can pull up Craigslist, you can pull up apartments.com and see listings for apartments or rentals that specifically say no Section 8, that specifically say we will not accept this form of payment. That would not be allowable in the city of Akron if we pass this legislation. And I will stop there, Mr. Chairman. I would invite Lauren from Fair Housing to chime in, and then we have Professor Lee, because the source of income legislation does have a component where, because we have the Akron Civil Rights Commission, it'll allow a tenant to file a complaint without necessarily having to go through the court system, at least initially. So I wanted to give both of them an opportunity. And then, of course, my colleague, Tamika Rose, who has also been working very diligently on this, if she has any comments. So Lauren.
Thank you. Thank you. Lauren from Fair Housing, if you could please introduce yourself. I don't see your last name on here, so you're more than welcome, and welcome to the Housing Committee.
Yes. Hello, all. I know a lot of you know me. I am Lauren Greenhall, the Associate Director at Fair Housing Contact Service. My full name is not on this screen because I'm trying to have name and agency on there to make sure folks know who we are. So, like I said, I think many of you know me, but our agency is the one of the private nonprofit organizations in Summit County that deals with concerns of housing discrimination. Our agency has been operating for almost 56 years now. We predate any of the fair housing laws that we currently operate under. And one of the key things that we do is we assist individuals with concerns of housing discrimination. And sometimes that is something that we run into a lot of barriers on, because what folks are being discriminated against is legal. So if folks are told they cannot pay their rent, even though they've been late and they have it now and they want to pay it and they can't, and they are then evicted, we have to tell them that's what the law currently says. If folks come to us and say, you know, I can't find a house, I keep being told no just because I have a voucher, but I'm a great tenant, no one will rent to me. We have to tell them, I'm sorry, that is the way that the law is right now, and folks aren't protected. 87% of households that utilize a voucher live in the city of Akron. This legislation will provide protections for that 87% of households. That is a huge number of households. There's 5,000 voucher holders in Summit County. So y'all can do the math on how many households that really is when they're looking at 87% live in the city of Akron. So we highly support this legislation. Our agency leads the eviction task force, and the eviction task force in Summit County is also standing behind both of these pieces of legislation so that we can have a community that is able to provide for the needs of its residents and also meet the needs of its housing providers. And so I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. I'm sure that you have some. I'll do my best to answer them. If I can't answer them, I promise to definitely find the answers and get back to y'all as well. So.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Yes, and now our cleanup hitter, you might say, Professor Lee. Thank you for joining.
I was just wondering if Councilwoman Omobian seems to have a hand up. Is that a?
Well, I would like to run the meeting. Well, I'd like to do that, hear from all the presenters, and then we'll open up to the committee, and then we'll open it up to all council.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that.
No, I appreciate that. Thank
you. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for asking me to be here. As was mentioned, I am Brent Lee. I am the chair of the Akron Civil Rights Commission and also a professor of law at the University of Akron School of Law. And I want to be clear that I'm here primarily to talk about the source of income piece. The Akron Civil Rights Commission, the concept for that legislation was shared with us, and the commission did think that it was a good idea to continue to develop. We are meeting tomorrow because when we have not yet met with the actual language in front of us, so I cannot represent to you that the commission has approved this, but we like the idea, and the language is not any different from what was presented, so I would be surprised if we did not go forward and endorse this. As was mentioned, we already have an apparatus, right, for there to be complaints filed and heard about discrimination. So it makes a lot of sense to simply add this, right, to the things that you cannot discriminate on. The Akron Civil Rights Ordinance already covers housing. And so this is a relatively simple way to do this. I am also familiar with this particular proposal because when my social justice lawyering class, we had students who looked into this last spring and found a bunch of research. There have been studies around the country where this idea is taking hold, right? And Mr. Hardy mentioned, right, the other cities in Ohio, states across the country. And I would just emphasize that this is not just about a sort of discrimination for its own sake, right? This is for people to escape a cycle of poverty, right? This allows people to sort of move into areas that are less high poverty, right? Which is really how you get a chance at upward mobility, right? Because we all have seen the studies where your zip code is the best predictor of future success in all kinds of ways, right? Economic and social and others. And this is one way where there's already a federal benefit, right? Trying to help people out. And we're just doing our part to allow that policy to do its work to help people find housing in places where they can thrive. So if there are other issues that come up, I'm happy to answer any questions that I know the answers to, and I will leave it at that. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you for all your good work too. We really appreciate you helping us out with the commission and all your good work. Thank you so much for all that, Professor Lee. With this, I'll open up to the committee members. If there's any questions or comments from any committee members, we'll move on to the rest of the council and open up questions or comments from all the council members. I see Ms. Samples, who's on the committee. You have your hand up, Ms. Samples.
Thank you, I'm Chairman Pesco. I have a few questions. So this is for the first piece of legislation. Does the legislation prohibit a landlord from paying full payment from a tenant and then still seeking eviction?
So I will invite Rebecca Advent, who worked with us from the law department on that question, Councilwoman, just to make sure we answer it appropriately.
Okay.
I'm sorry, my audio cut out for a second. Can you repeat your question?
Yes, so does this legislation prohibit a landlord from refusing full payment in eviction?
It doesn't require a landlord to accept the payment the way it's written. It provides the tenant with a defense to go to the court if the landlord does not accept it. If they offer it and the landlord does not accept it, and then they still try to institute an eviction action against the tenant, then the tenant could go before the court and say, you know, I tried to pay them in full and they refused it. And then that would be a defense in the eviction action. And then the court would be the one that interprets that and, you know, makes the judgment on that.
And Councilwoman, I would just add that it deals specifically with failure to pay as a cause of action, not necessarily if there were to be another cause of action on an eviction, such as like damage of property or things like that. It's just
right. So, yeah, I'm speaking directly about failure to pay, and then they have the money and the landlord won't accept it. So, but for me, someone who comes from the courthouse, I've seen this happen where people will come in, try to make payment, and the landlord refuse it. So I don't know if it would even be possible to write into this, maybe stating something about them, maybe putting it on, I don't know, a bond with the clerk's office and having them hold their money in escrow, the full payment, if the landlord refuses to take it before court. That's my biggest concern, is when you have a tenant who's trying to pay and you have a landlord who won't take the money. So now they're going to end up with the eviction, even though they've been trying to pay the landlord. It happens a lot. So that's one of my concerns, is making sure there's a safety net for someone who's trying to pay and you have a landlord who won't accept it. This legislation is wonderful, because I've seen it happen to too many people over in the courthouse. And I think this is definitely going to be a great safety net for them, but to make sure that there's some kind of escrow involved, just as a safety net if the landlord still pushes forth on an eviction.
I'm sorry to interrupt. There is a provision that allows for you to put it in escrow after the action has already been filed.
Awesome. Okay, and then my second question is, does the second piece of legislation, will it prohibit a landlord from, when they advertise their properties, some of them will put on there, no vouchers accepted, no Section 8 accepted. Will it prohibit them from doing that?
yes.
Awesome. That's all I had.
Very good. Thank you. Any other committee members have any questions or comments? Very good. I'll try to take everyone in order that I saw their hand. Linda Mobian, I know you've been waiting for a while. You're more than welcome to for comment.
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you for acknowledging me. I realized I jumped the gun when I raised my hand, because I know you go to committee members first. It just so happened that this legislation is so timely. I was listening and participated in the Co-Ohio conference this morning, and there's a lot of talk about evictions and all of the resources that are coming through this new act that just passed. Because it sounds like there are a number of dollars available to not only help the tenants stay in the facility, in their respective apartment or house, but there are also dollars available to assist in other ways. For instance, if there are problems with the property that they have created, I know the landlord doesn't have to take the money, but it makes a stronger case if they go to court that they've offered to pay rent as well as back pay. Now, the reasonable back pay, I heard you say $25. Did you say $25 or 5% of the monthly fee or 5% of the total? Which did you say, James?
It's both. So it's the greater of $25 or 5% of a monthly rent.
I see. Okay. And then there are dollars on top of this that I know Columbus, Cincinnati, Dayton, and several other major cities are using, because I guess this pot of money that is going around the country is giving us an opportunity of a lifetime, because we probably won't see these resources again, to help try to stabilize folks in their particular residences, because they've been impacted so negatively about job loss and the pandemic and all of that. So do we have any idea of what is available to help if, let's say, they can pay the back rent and the reasonable late fee, but if there are other things like damage to the apartment or something like that, that would be what the landlord may try to use. Do we know what resources are there for that? And the other thing that I heard repeatedly from the presenters is that our major asset will be to start meeting with landlords throughout the city and creating positive relationships to see how we can mitigate some of these things that they often run into with their tenants, and maybe get a list of them and work with them to see what can we do. Because I realize that, we're talking about business owners as well when we start talking about landlords, but they were talking about all of the work they've done to create these positive relationships with landlords in order for them to work with all of these individuals and agencies that are trying to represent them. I know I've said a lot, but I hope you can follow what I'm asking, James.
I think so. I'm going to respond quickly and then invite Lauren, who might have a little bit more information about what's currently out there. But as you know, and as council knows, through the Summit County CARES Act money that they receive directly, there's been a substantial amount of rental assistance that's been disseminated through United Way, ASCA, and other key community organizations. The state has also made available millions more that is currently out there available for rental assistance. We have had situations where landlords have not accepted that grant money. And so this would also protect as that continues to be an issue for months to come. But Lauren, you might have other information specifically about how we are absolutely looking to form better relationships with landlords, to reach out. I know, Councilwoman Amobian, that we are looking internally within OID on how we can help with CDBG dollars to fix up places that have been damaged by a previous tenant, to keep a landlord with us when there is a bad experience, which is actually rarer than a lot of people know. But Lauren may have just briefly some other thoughts on that.
Good. I'd like to just mention that I directed in your inbox. There was a press release today from Eileen Shapiro in reference to the Summit County CARES Round 2, $16 million to Summit County altogether is what we're receiving. I think the first round was $15 million. They've had so far 5,335 applications, mortgage, utility, and rent. All of those qualify from what I understand. So that's that. I think that is a piece of it, Ms. Amobi, in terms of your question. But the other one is the resources available for the landlords to repair. So I think that's, Lauren, I don't know if you could add to that.
Yeah, I think in regards to repair, maybe what Ms. Moby and what you have been hearing about is in regards to mitigation funds. That's often what that's called, that communities have, that landlords could, if they agree that they will, a lot of times how it works is that if landlords agree that they will accept a certain population of individuals within our community, oftentimes individuals who have a history of chronic homelessness or are coming out of homeless shelters, if they agree to accept those tenants specifically or work exclusively with programs that provide resources for those tenants, then if there was damage that was caused to the unit, that program would provide funds to repair those damages. That's oftentimes how it works. There's a variety of mitigation funds that I'm familiar with. It's not always like that, but oftentimes that's how it works. And oftentimes Cohio, to speak of their conference, is frequently discussing those type of funds for those populations. But to my knowledge, the funds that exist in our community currently cannot necessarily be used in that way, but I know that there has been some conversation with our continuum of care and with city officials about developing a mitigation fund, and I think that's definitely something that my agency, and I believe the continuum of care, as I'm the chair of the continuum of care board, I'll speak for them as well to say that that would definitely be something that would be we would want to look into and be interested in developing for our community, and I think would be a huge help in our community to navigate moving forward with finding stable, affordable, safe housing for everyone in our community, and maintaining that housing for housing providers to not have to turn over their units as well.
Mr. Chair, may I just follow up briefly, please?
Certainly, Ms. Logan.
Yeah, the one thing that I heard too that was so helpful is that they did an overlay of census tracts that were the most in need communities, and it was wonderful how they displayed it. That you look at those communities and see how are we impacting those areas. So I don't know if we're planning to do anything like that, Mr. Hardy, or not, but I wonder if we could come up with that, because I'm sure we should know where are the most needs are in our city. And like this, these are one-time only dollars that we're going to ever see. And I'm not just talking about the CARES dollars. I'm talking about the major dollars that are coming here from the federal government. How will these dollars impact those most in need communities in the city of Akron? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. I believe Mr. Neal is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate this that was brought in. I do want to ask that, and this may have already been done, but I'm thinking of when we had the issue with the water bill. I want to make sure that we contact the Akron Canton Real Estate Association, that group that's worked with Judge Oldfield, to make sure that we get their perspective. I do have a few questions, and for full disclaimer, I am a home provider. I've owned rental property for over 20, since I've moved back, so over 30 years I've owned rental property in Akron. My one concern is with the cap fees. If we cap them on what the tenant can pay, we need to look at capping the fees on what banks, mortgage companies, and others can charge the property owner. Because some of those fees are higher than the 5%, because if they don't get their mortgage money, they can't pay their rent, and maybe they can't pay their mortgage. If they don't get the rent, they can't pay their mortgage. And that may be looking at how they finance the property, because if you know anything about real estate, people finance that all kind of ways, from traditional banks to credit cards, to hard money lenders. Hard money lenders charge 2 or 3 points. Mr. Fusco, being in real estate, he'll know this, and then they'll charge 15 to 17% interest or more. So, I mean, looking at holistically how this works. On the forms of payment, are we talking about taking credit cards as well? Because if you ask a landlord to take credit cards, of course, then you run into the fees associated with credit cards. Or now more tenants want to pay with Cash App or PayPal, and those fees. And, you know, we see that on the basic retail end. You see more and more retailers pushing those finance charges onto the consumer. Gas stations are doing it all the time. They show you the credit card price, the cash price. That's something we want to look at, because that could be a challenge. Because I have tenants that want to pay me with a credit card, and I'm like, unless you want to pay the fees, I'm not going to take a credit card payment. And then the other thing is, I think a lot of times, you know, when you say that they can't take the payment, a lot of that's going to depend on what the lease is like. A lot of folks have where you have the lease and after a year, it automatically reverts to a 30-day lease unless they re-up that lease again. And so if it's 30 days, at the end of 30 days, there's no legal recourse because technically either party has the right to terminate it without any penalty. So these are just some things we want to think about. And then last but not least, the challenge with Section 8 for a lot of people is that Section 8 will, a tenant has to fix up a property. Section 8 will penalize a landlord even though they fix up the property. Section 8 will withhold rent until that property is repaired. So that creates hardship on the landlord. So I'm just saying, if we're going to do this, all parties have to play a role in this and take responsibility, because, I mean, it's real. And then last but not least, I think of the one tenant, one landlord, Mr. Prier, that came down. I don't think it's a problem with me mentioning his name because he came during public comment period and shared this information where he had a tenant that was a problem tenant, was paying the rent, but not the water bill. The water bill was part of the agreement. The city shut off the water because they got so far behind. The tenant then called the health department and said, hey, my water's off. Health department forced the landlord to turn on the water, even though it was in the rental agreement that it was the tenant's responsibility. Tenant paid rent, but ran the water bill up again and then ditched them. So I'm just saying we have to, that's why I'm hoping that I appreciate this because I know I know we have to do something. But there's so many different variables in this equation. I'd just like for us to take a look at them all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Thank you. I'm going to try to stick to the thing here. Mr. Hardy, did you have a real quick comment?
Just real quick, I would just say that I would submit respectfully that the interests of landlords carry the day 99 times out of 100 in the city of Akron. It is one of the easiest places to own a property, rent a property, and evict someone from a property in the nation, the best in the state. These are very simple protections to try and give a little bit back to the tenant in terms of helping them in their situation. It is not meant to penalize a landlord, but I would say that to your question specifically, if you want to pass along the credit card fee, that is not prohibited under this ordinance, but it is prohibited to not accept a credit card if that's how they want to pay. And I think that, again, being a landlord is important. I know we have a lot of folks renting in the city, but it is not an obligation. It is, at the end of the day, a source of income for the landlord as well. And I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing that housing vouchers require up to code housing in order to receive the benefit of locked in rental payments. So I think that I understand that there's always a concern for landlords, but this is really truly our attempt to try and bring some of the tenant concerns to the table, given the fact that it is tilted so heavily now towards the needs and wants of landlords.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. What we'll do is I'm gonna request that we take time. Obviously on this one, there's a lot of moving parts, tons of them. So we're gonna have a lot of comments, a lot of discussion. And Mr. Neal, to your point about I wrote down the Akron Real Estate Association. I would like to bring them in, obviously, of course, and others to conversation, obviously, of course. And we're gonna need to really look at each piece and part of the entire scope of what we're looking at here. So thank you for those comments again. Mr. Malik?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think that I strongly support both of these pieces of legislation. I think we all know that we have a lack of stable, affordable, quality housing here in Akron. And, one of the indications of that, as Mr. Hardy has stated, is, that 2019 data that shows us having the highest eviction rate in the state and 24th highest in the nation. Folks are being priced out of the market. And so I think these are some pretty straightforward protections that we've seen in other jurisdictions, right? I think that Dayton and Toledo have adopted pay to stay. I think Columbus recently adopted source of income. I really appreciate the work of the eviction task force. I've been able to participate in some of their meetings, and they really have helped develop and advocate some of these ideas. I think I totally agree with you that this is something where we need to really look at the details, and we need to make sure to address these kinds of questions that Mr. Neal and others have raised. I would also like to hear from folks in the municipal court specifically about the implementation of pay to stay, right? So I think that would be helpful. But I also think that this is an opportunity to use this as the first step in sort of broader conversations about how we can work on these issues, right? Because as Mr. Hardy said, again, these are not going to resolve all of our eviction issues. They're not going to resolve all of our housing issues. They're deeper than any particular reforms. And so I hope we can talk about, in Cleveland, they have a right to counsel program so that, to make sure that tenants have counsel helping them on their behalf to make the process a little more even-handed, right? We can talk about hopefully investing, to Ms. Mobian's point, some of our rescue plan dollars in revitalizing our existing neighborhoods. So, I think these particular pieces are great, but I hope that it's part of a broader conversation that we have. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Malik. And also, this is going to probably take some time to work through and address. But after that, I really want the committee and all of council, I think what we need to do, and heard this earlier, and been kind of on my mind in terms of going through our housing code itself and kind of like looking at it overall, because some of this, some of it is somewhat outdated, I'm sure. So it's time to revisit and time to look at that as well. So we're going to be going forward. We're looking at some of that after this, and obviously welcome all kinds of comments from everyone. Tara, would you like to go next? And then Mike, is that okay?
Just briefly, I heard you say you're going to bring in maybe someone from the Realtors Association. I'm not sure if maybe Mr. Hardy or someone in administration can look into, I know there's been a lot of CARES Act dollars floating everywhere, millions. I would like to know how are we tracking funds going to landlords? I mean, they're business owners, they're a business. They've been giving out business PPEs and grants all over the place. So my concern is landlords who have gained the system, but yet still evicting people. It concerns me that we may have landlords who have gotten a lot of money, yet still they were evicting tenants. So I don't know who can track that or how we track that, but I know it has to exist. That was my only question. So if we could look into that, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, very good. Thank you for that comment. Okay, Mr. Freeman, I promised you next.
Right. I put my hand down because Mr. Neal brought up a lot of the questions that I had as well. And I was just kind of thinking about some of our landlords that are not heavy on the capital side. And obviously, if rent doesn't come in for 3 or 4 months, they're not going to experience the same kind of maybe forgiveness from their bank, their lending institution that we're affording those that are paying rent. So, and I think this is going to be a lengthy discussion that we're going to have, but I do think that Mr. Neal brought up some good points that we do need to mull over. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman. Thank you for your comments. Mr. Kamer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just like what Mike Freeman said, Councilman Freeman, Councilman Neal did bring up a lot of good concerns that are my concerns too. I know Councilman Malik mentioned about bringing in the municipal court. So those are all things. I just want my voice to be heard, that I do hope that we take a deeper dive into this and really get it right before we pass any legislation. I think you're on board with that, but I just wanted to give my 2 cents and I believe Councilman Neal did bring up a lot of good issues, and I think moving forward, we'll get this right and bring all parties to the table to discuss this. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Kamer. I would like to respect, okay, Mr. Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to, again, this always happens when we bring stuff in. We always say, well, we got to talk to the landlords. There are always landlords who call us every time we bring this type of legislation in. We need to do some things for the tenants that are for the tenants. And this is a very basic way of doing that. It does not disrupt. We need to reform the housing code. We need to have better housing code enforcement. We need zoning code reform. We need all kinds of things that cost money. We need a housing court that costs money. This is a no-cost option to provide just a little bit of affirmative support for the people who rent. And just to give you a baseline, and I will provide this to council when they're done, but the Harvard Kennedy School for free has done a landlord survey for us of our entire rental registry, which is only half of the units we have in the city because the other half never file. And we can never seem to get them to do it, and we never penalize them. But beyond that, 13% of them are looking to evict their tenants in the next 6 months. That's thousands of units in the city of Akron. That's tens of thousands of people who need a shelter. So for a landlord, yes, it's a business. It's a source of income. They might only have 1 or 2 properties, but for the tenant, it's their shelter. So I'm just hoping that we can have a conversation. When we say we need to hear from all sides, it usually devolves into what's best for the landlord, quite honestly. I think we need to have a balanced conversation this time and really start to look at the fact that we have a moniker of the worst city in Ohio for evictions, and we have to start doing something about it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Hardy. Appreciate it. The one thing, and this is for Professor Lee or for Lauren, and maybe you guys know, I'd like to try to figure out how we got here and why we're here. And it seems to me that, and it would be interesting to find out, I recall after the recession, there was a, excuse me, program that the state of Ohio had where they had encouraged people to stay in their house. They helped with regards to refinancing. They helped with regards to funding, to stay in your house. This is 10, 11, 12, right around that time frame, 2010, 11, 12. And I remember we were counseled collectively, all of us together were working together to promote this program to keep people in their houses. And this was, I recall a meeting that we had meetings all over the city. One meeting at Mason Park, 75, 80 people attended. And even people afterwards said, what a great program that was, that, my son is still in their house to this day, they were on the edge. And now we've moved to this here, right here. And sometimes I think maybe the past kind of teaches us how to, go forward. And it'd be interesting to find out what, like I said, the state of Ohio pulled that. It seemed to be successful keeping people in their houses. Lauren, I saw you your hand up. You have a response to this? Can you help us?
I can speak to it. Yeah, our agency is one of those agencies that provided that assistance that came out as a result of the housing crisis. And unfortunately, though, that's for homeowners, and owner occupied units is what all of that was for. It was not for renters. And because landlords are business owners, it was not geared for properties that were owned and operated by an entity of any sort, whether that's a private landlord that just has 1 or 2 properties or a large corporation. It wasn't geared for that. The program does still exist and is still running. It's just the need is not there the way that it was basically almost a decade ago now. So yeah. And if I'm permitted, I can respond to at least a couple of Mr. Neal's questions, if I'm permitted.
Well, I'd like to close that comment up, okay, if you don't mind, and then we'll go back to you. Just that the thing of it is it's a different program that exists today because they pulled it, is what I'm trying to say. We had this program to keep people after the recession in their houses. Okay, it was successful. The state of Ohio pulled the program away from people. Therefore, people they had to abandon their houses all over the state of Ohio, including Akron. And so I suspect some of those folks moved in as tenants. And that's the evolution you would think that would occur. And now, we have this crisis going on. And I would just like to find out, like, how did we get here? And how is, in terms of our laws, and why is it, that, and maybe what Mr. Hardy's saying is that, our rules are such that, we got to change them dramatically. I don't know, but that's just part of, like I said, the history of how we got here. We had this wildly successful program to keep people in their houses, and they pulled it. And so that's maybe I just miscommunicated the kind of program it was. I'm not trying to, I'm just saying some of those people obviously became tenants. They were homeowners and now they're tenants. It seems like that's the trend. That's been the trend in the last 10 years, that home ownership is now kind of a thing that people don't aspire to, it seems. It seems like they aspire to being tenants. I don't understand, especially whenever you consider the fact that your payments are lower oftentimes whenever you own a home versus renting a home. This trend, appraiser friends of mine were telling me this 10, 11, 12 years ago. They were saying, we're seeing more and more of these houses, single family houses throughout Akron. They're now being occupied by tenants and not owners. And it was a trend that we discovered, a while back. And it, like I said, something caused this, and I just don't understand. That's all. But anyways, Lauren, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that's.
No, you're fine. Of course. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. So to speak to one of Mr. Neal's questions in regards to the inspections and potential abatement. So I know that AMHA is probably going to come and chat with you all at some point in time and be able to answer very specific questions about voucher process and when somebody utilizes a voucher and what that means for a housing provider and all of that. But just to give a little bit of understanding here today for you all, what is required for inspections for somebody that's utilizing a housing choice voucher, formerly known as Section 8 voucher, is actually a lower threshold than what our current building code is. The Eviction Task Force has, and along with some of Brandt's students, have worked together to compare the current municipal code with what is required by housing choice voucher inspection, and our current municipal code in Akron for the health and safety of housing is actually a stricter standard than what is required by the housing choice voucher program. So that's something to be aware of there for everyone. Also, when it does come to repairs that need to be made, those are done and assessed based on who's responsible for them when a voucher holder is living in a property. So if there's damage that's done to the property and it is the tenant's responsibility, then the tenant is held accountable for that. If it is the landlord's responsibility to fix, then the landlord is held accountable for that. And they're given proper time to fix that, which is 30 days. And that's what our Ohio law actually affords for repairs to be made as well. If it's something significant, like the door will not close, so there's a safety issue there, or there is no running water, or there is no heat, or something of that sort, that's a shorter time frame, but that's also what our Ohio law, tenant landlord law, does provide for as well. So really the voucher program and the stipulations around the voucher program really are very similar to what any private landlord is experiencing on the open market as well.
So it's more restricted than our current code, which kind of might explain.
Our current code is more restrictive than what the voucher program requires.
Okay, so our code is more restrictive than, okay, thank you.
Yes. So if you're following housing code, then there should not be concerns in your property about it passing an inspection, is where I'm going with that. Mm-hmm.
Perfect, thank you so much. Tamika Rose, I saw your hand was up a minute ago.
Yes, Chairman Fusco. I just wanted to talk to the members to you and the members of the committee and say that, as James has enlightened us, this is but a smidget of kind of allowing tenants to have a little bit of equity when we are talking about landlords and tenant relationships. Right now, it is so heavily weighted, and it is weighted in the way that the Ohio Revised Code sees tenant-landlord relationships, which is actually based off of, over in England, you know, the landlord tenant property owners. So we just need to come into the 21st century and, you know, look at ways that we can be a little bit more equitable with our community. You know, we have a huge homeless population, the largest eviction per capita in the state, and 23rd, 24th in the nation. We need to do something about this. And I encourage all of you to reach out to myself, Lauren, Professor Lee, AMHA, the United Way, to find out how this problem is, you know, it's a burden. We talk about housing every day. And so I just really would ask you to reach out to us to educate, and we will be sending more information to you. This is not a bashing of landlords. This is just more of a sense of trying to equalize the playing field. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I think Professor Lee is next.
Thank you. You know, I just wanted to respond to your question about,
You're on mute.
about what is going on. I think that I would make a distinction between sort of ordinary time reasoning, right? Where, you know, the complaints that landlords or tenants might have are the same complaints that they might have sort of any time in the last 50 years, where if a tenant doesn't pay their rent, how am I going to afford to pay my mortgage, right? And so those are all really reasonable sort of ordinary time questions. But the problems that we're dealing with are not ordinary, right? They have been building up for decades. The low lack of sort of affordable housing in Akron, that didn't happen. The ordinary system isn't working, right? Ordinarily, you would say, well, where are the developers and what would the incentives be? However the incentives are, the way the structure is set up, right, is not producing the housing that meets the demand. Part of it is the polarization of wealth, right? Part of it is the sort of national property owning conglomerates that are they got into the single family home market, right? Which is sort of a different thing. So I just want to sort of add that in, as when we have these concerns about how exactly is a landlord going to pay these fees, we're trying to, with these, you know, start to change a little bit of the structure, right? And it is a long-term process. And I think that maybe, I hope, might help frame sort of what we're talking about today.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Mr. Malik?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I wish Professor Lee would have continued, because I could listen to him talk about these issues all day. I think that, as a number of folks have said today at the meeting, I think any objective look at Ohio landlord tenant law will, you know, show that the law is slanted towards landlords. That doesn't mean that landlords' wishes shouldn't be heard. They absolutely should be heard in this process. But I think that, you know, these are pretty minor, reasonable accommodations, particularly when you're talking about, you know, the fairness of someone who's shown up at the courthouse with the money in hand and saying, look, you know, there's no reason for me to lose my house today, right? And at the same time, you know, someone at the front end saying, hey, you know, I have the money to pay you right now, you know, but I'm not allowed to live here because it's a voucher or because it's, you know, Social Security disability or what have you. So I think those are kind of fairness things, and we can figure out, you know, are the utility bills part of that definition or not? We can figure out, you know, how the specifics work, because I think, you know, Mr. Neal raised a great point. I wasn't thinking about Cash App or, you know, some of those things. But I do think, you know, we have an opportunity here to, again, use this as a starting point to really have a broader conversation. And that's this problem not going to be solved unless everyone is at the table, right? And that's AMHA, that's all of our housing providers, that's the court system, that's our housing division in the city, which has, you know, which if we were able to staff more, would be able to do more of those inspections. You know, the rental registration program is a huge part of that. So there's a lot of work to be done here, but we really need to make sure everyone, so these conversations are hard, right? We've been having hard conversations about policing, But, you know, we need to make sure that we are having as many voices represented, but that we're also clear about the realities as well.
Thank you, Mr. Malik. Yes, Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just while we were talking, landlords, they do have associations that they can be a part of that help lobby on behalf of their interests locally and on the state level. I'm thinking, we've had tenants come down and try to speak individually on their behalf in regards to HEAP and the water bill, or in regards to issues. Something we may want to think of is working with those who are on this call here and with the city, having a tenant course that they could go through where they get somebody who has something like this, where they get a certificate, but also where they become a part of an association, a City of Akron Tenant Association, where their voice can help us create better policy and work with the Akron Canton Real Estate Investment Association, as well as the Realtors Association, to help us, hear their voice and make sure that as we do things, we do them in the right way. I mean, I've expressed concern about, and I know I don't want to speak for the planning department, but some of our policies in regards to housing where we don't permit certain rental units in areas, inadvertently discriminate against those folks. So I think as I'm just brainstorming, Mr. Chairman, we may want to see if other communities have like a tenant association where they can learn best practice, go through the whole thing. We've got the LIFT program so that they know how to make sure that they're managing their bills, maybe tie it in with what United Way is doing with their economic piece, but more so that they can have a unified voice in this discussion as well. Because right now, we've got to find a tenant here, a tenant there. But if we help them organize, it'll strengthen their voice and it'll help us make better policy.
Thank you. Thank you. The question, though, for subject matter experts, we had heard that other cities have done this, and I don't know if this is relatively new or if this has been done in other cities and other states for some time, like for a few years where it's measurable. It seems like the end game here, the goal of this legislation is to reduce the amount of evictions overall, and that this could very well do that. Is there any data out there that we can see from other cities that indicate these type of actions would reduce the amount of evictions? Would there be any data out there like that?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we'll make sure we provide that to City Council. I would say, though, that again, these are but scratching the surface in terms of all the different layers that cause an eviction that created the eviction environment we have right now. So these alone are not going to drive our eviction rate into the basement, right? It's a piece of the iceberg in that regard. But we will get you all of that data here within the next week or two.
Yeah, and like I said, I realize that. I think that we mentioned balance, and the balance needs to be part of this, and getting all the voices together and hearing them, and then making decisions, and then moving forward after this in terms of reviewing other pieces of our housing. I think we've seen some success, obviously, with the mayor's initiative to, the 15-year abatement program. We've seen some investment in our community that we haven't seen in a while. The affordable housing piece, obviously, you hear one piece that says that, affordable housing, but then again, you hear that Akron, some of our rates per square foot is some of the lowest as well in the country too. So there's a yin and yang to the whole thing, I guess, in terms of, like what it is that you want to, the balance piece. And so I think this is a very great beginning in terms of a conversation, and there's going to be many, many more ahead. I see Ms. Amobian's hand up again.
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. I have two questions. I asked a question about the census tract, if someone can provide that kind of information in terms of where is the most need in our city? And the second question I have goes to Mr. Hardy. When do we need to make a decision? Because I know this money has to be spent. I'm not really sure exactly when, but they all seem to have some kind of deadline. Some of those are years and some are not necessarily that long. So when do we need to make a decision?
Councilwoman, I think the first question, we will definitely endeavor to generate some maps, if not census tract level, certainly by zip code, around where is rental relief going now, where's the highest need, et cetera, and see what we can do with our partners there. And then there really is not a fixed timetable to this piece of legislation, other than to say that we are in the midst of a crisis now, right? So, I mean, we learned from the Beacon Journal and from the Devil Strip that our municipal court is still evicting people, even in the midst of the CDC moratorium somehow. And so it's still happening, but there's this huge deluge that is going to come once that moratorium is eventually lifted, and the economy does or does not rebound like we hope it does. So I think this has more to do with the crisis of the timing of the crisis versus the timing of federal aid coming, if that's helpful.
Yeah, that's helpful, but how is the municipal court able to do this in the midst of the moratorium that's on evictions?
That is
Do we
an outstanding
know?
question that I do not have a good answer for, but I think someone should ask. Yes.
Thank you. I think that's going to be part of the future conversations.
Okay.
I saw Professor Lee.
So you were asking for data. Actually, first of all, I think that the United Way has a heat map for the rental assistance that they've distributed. HUD did do a study. This is not about the pay to stay and the evictions, but on the a source of income, where they did a pretty rigorous study with 5 different cities in the country. And you know, you can't say definitively as a matter of social science, but in the 3 cities that they looked at that did not have source of income protections, right? The rate of voucher denial, right, was at 78%, 76%, 60, really pretty high. And in the 2 jurisdictions they looked at that had a source of income protection, they had voucher denial rates of 31% and 15%. So every city is different, but that looks like the source of income legislation would have a pretty significant impact.
Thank you so much for that information. That's very helpful. If you could please forward that, or I'd be happy to share that with the rest of the council and the committee. Thank you. Mr. Malik, I see your hands up.
And just briefly, to address Ms. Amobian's point, there was a judge that did overturn the CDC moratorium, but ultimately there are some courts that are still following it while it's still working its way through the appellate procedure, and there's some courts that are not still following it. So, but I think this underscores why it would be helpful to have the municipal court's voice here at the table and in part of future conversations, because again, there's not going to be a solution to this issue, this broader issue, without the municipal court, as well as council, as well as the administration.
Thank you. Very good. All right, great comments from everyone. Great healthy exchange. Anything else from anyone? Okay, very good. Thank you, Mr. Hardy, for that. Any other comments or questions from anyone whatsoever? Thank you all, especially our special guests that came today. Thank you so much for sharing with us. We certainly appreciate all your comments. Thank you so much, and please feel free to reach out anytime if there's anything we could do to help, or if there's anything moving forward. Obviously, we would love to hear from you. Thank you all.
Thank you. My email is in the chat if anyone wants to reach out as well, but others on here know how to get a hold of me too. Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Lee, as well. Thank you all. With that, the Housing Committee is adjourned. I should probably take a vote on.
I was going to say, do you want to make a motion?
Sure, yeah, I would like to entertain a motion. We got caught up in our discussion. Is there a motion to refer item number 2, actually, is the first one, I believe. Motion to refer item 2.
That motion for time.
Second.
Second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Hence, the ayes have it. Thank you. And then a motion for item number 3.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor of referring item number 3 signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Hence, the ayes have it. Very good. Thank you. Thank you all. We're adjourned.
This was the final committee meeting of the day. Council will meet again